Colorado Rockies, winter of 1913. Elevation nearly 9,000 feet, where the wind never fully stops and the cold arrives before the sun sets. In a scattered mining settlement called Larkspur Hollow, the most respected builder in the county stood in the frozen mud outside a half-finished structure and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "That thing is a coffin with a roof. It'll kill her before January's out." He was talking about Agnes Kowalski's cabin. Or rather, what wasn't a cabin at all. A curved steel shell, salvaged and reshaped, sitting low against a mountainside like something that didn't belong in a town built entirely of square log walls and steep pitched roofs. Nobody in Larkspur Hollow had seen anything like it, and almost nobody believed it would survive the season. This is a story of how a widow with no formal training in construction outbuilt the most experienced tradesmen in the region, and how the coldest blizzard in a generation forced an entire town to admit she'd understood something they hadn't. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why her curved steel roof and packed earth walls outperformed traditional log cabins when it mattered most, and what principle of heat retention she was using nearly a century before it had a name in any textbook. If frontier engineering like this fascinates you, subscribe now. Every week, we bring you one real historical technique that worked when survival wasn't optional. Hit like if you want to see exactly how this played out, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from tonight. Agnes Kowalski had lived in Larkspur Hollow for 6 years before her husband, a coal miner named Tomasz, died in a shaft collapse 11 miles north. She stayed, not because leaving wasn't an option, but because the small parcel of land they claimed together, backed against a limestone ridge, was the only thing she had left that felt permanent. For 2 winters after Tomasz's death, Agnes lived in the same log cabin every other family in the hollow used as their model. Square-cut timber walls, a stone hearth at one end, gaps chinked with mud and moss that had to be repacked every autumn before the frost set in. It was a standard. It was what worked, according to everyone who had built there before her. Except it didn't work. Not really, not for a woman alone. Cutting and hauling her own firewood, unable to keep pace with a house that devoured cordwood the way the wind devoured heat through every seam in the log walls. By her second winter alone, Agnes was burning nearly a full cord of wood every 10 days just to keep the single main room above freezing. Her hands cracked from the cold work of splitting logs faster than she could season them. Twice, she woke the frost on the inside of the window panes. She began asking questions nobody else in the hollow was asking. Not, how do I build a bigger hearth? But, why does this house lose heat as fast as I can make it? The log walls, however thick, were still flat vertical surfaces exposed directly to wind that came screaming down off the ridge in long, unbroken gusts. Every square foot of wall was a square foot losing warmth to moving air. It was Tomasz's old mining connections that gave her the unlikely material. A rail spur 3 miles east had abandoned a stockpile of corrugated steel arch panels, meant originally for a mine entrance reinforcement project that never got funded. Sheets of curved galvanized steel, roughly 18 feet in span, sitting rusting in a field. The rail company sold the entire lot for almost nothing, glad to have it hauled away. Agnes had an idea that made sense to no one but her. Build low, build curved, and let the mountain's own wind and snow work for her instead of against her. A Quonset-style arch structure, half buried into the hillside itself, with the curve of the steel roof facing directly into prevailing wind. Where flat log walls caught gusts like a sail, a curved surface would deflect them. Where a raised cabin floor let cold air pool underneath, a structure set partially below grade would use the earth itself. A steady 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius year-round, just a few feet down, as a thermal buffer against the brutal air above. What Agnes built over 4 months, working mostly alone with occasional help from a hired teamster, was unlike anything in Larkspur Hollow. She excavated roughly 3 feet into the hillside for the structure's footprint, creating a partial earth berm along the north and west faces. the directions the worst wind and weather came from. Into this excavated shelf, she anchored the curved steel arch panels, bolted section to section, forming a continuous barrel-vaulted shell about 28 feet long and 16 feet wide. Between the steel shell and an inner wall of rough-cut timber planking, she packed a 12-inch cavity with a mixture of dry straw, with ash and compacted earth, an insulating layer with no single name at the time, but functioning exactly the way modern bad insulation does, trapping still air in thousands of tiny pockets, since it's trapped air, not the material itself, that resists heat transfer. The floor was her most technically deliberate choice. Rather than timber planks laid directly over open crawl space, the standard method, and the reason so many cabin floors stayed bitterly cold. Agnes laid a bed of fist-sized creek stones roughly 10 inches deep beneath the floor planking, packed with earth around them. Stone holds heat far longer than wood or earth alone. Warmed gradually by a stove running through the day, that stone mass released heat slowly overnight, keeping the floor from ever fully going cold even after the fire died down. At the room center, she built a squat masonry stove using salvaged firebrick from an abandoned smelter operation. Its flue routed through nearly 6 feet of interior masonry before reaching the curved roof. Every extra foot of masonry contact meant more heat pulled from the exhaust gases before they escaped, rather than wasted straight up a chimney the way most hearths in the hollow operated. To anyone glancing at it from the road, it looked exactly like what Silas Redmond called it, a shed, low, curved, half-buried, with none of the vertical pride of a proper log cabin. What it actually was, though, was a structure engineered, instinctively, through trial and reasoning rather than formal training, to minimize every pathway heat could escape through, wind exposure, floor conduction, and chimney loss all addressed at once. Silas Redmond had built or supervised the construction of at least 30 structures across the county over 18 years. He was, by any measure, the closest thing Larkspur Hollow had to a licensed authority on how a mountain home should be built, and he made his opinion of Agnes Kowalski's project known loudly, repeatedly, and in front of anyone who would listen. "A house stands up," he told a gathering outside the general store that autumn. "It doesn't crouch in the dirt like something hiding from a storm." He predicted the packed earth insulation would rot the timber inner walls within 2 years. He predicted the buried steel would trap moisture and rust through in 5. He predicted, with the confidence of a man who had never been meaningfully challenged, that the first hard freeze would crack the masonry stove and leave her without heat entirely. Worse than Redmond's technical criticism was the social judgment that followed it through town. Women didn't build. Widows, especially, were expected to remarry, move in with family, or at minimum hire a man to correct whatever mistake they'd made alone. Agnes's low steel roof structure became something the Hollow's children were worn away from and something the adults joked about at the tavern. Kowalski's burrow, they called it. Her badger den. One neighbor, a freight hauler named Otis Pruitt, put it more bluntly than most, telling her directly that no self-respecting mountain family would ever live in something that looked like it belonged to livestock rather than people. Agnes said little in response to any of it. She finished the roof seams, banked earth higher against the north wall, and split enough with a tester stove through the shoulder season before the real cold arrived. The blizzard arrived on the second week of December 1913 and did not relent for 11 days. Local records, pieced together later from mail route logs in the county assessor's office, described temperatures falling to 18 below 0 Fahrenheit, roughly minus 28 degrees Celsius, at the storm's coldest point, with sustained winds strong enough to close the only wagon road connecting Larkspur Hollow to the rail junction 11 miles south. Snow accumulation buried fence lines and outbuildings across the hollow. Wood piles that families had assumed would carry them through the entire season were half consumed within the first 4 days as households burned wood at double or triple their normal rate, simply trying to keep single rooms above freezing. Chimneys clogged with ice and snow-driven downdrafts. More than one family reported smoke backing up into their main room, forcing windows open even in the deadly cold just to breathe. Silas Redmond's own home, by several accounts, fared no better than his neighbors. Wind found every seam in log walls that had stood for over a decade, and his family reportedly kept 2 stoves burning around the clock, simply to hold the interior in the low 40s Fahrenheit. 3 miles east, isolated further than most by the terrain around her hillside claim, Agnes Kowalski's low steel roof structure sat almost entirely swallowed by drifted snow that, rather than threatening the building, was doing exactly what her curved roof design had anticipated, adding another insulating layer over a shell already built to shed wind rather than fight it. If you've made it this far, stay with us, because the number that came out of that blizzard is the one that ended the argument in Larkspur Hollow for good, and it might change how you think about the shape of your own shelter. Like this video, and subscribe now if you want the full account of what happened when the storm finally broke. Dr. Ansel Pratt, the region's only physician, made his rounds by sled once the worst of the wind eased enough to travel, checking on isolated homesteads for frostbite, illness, and fuel shortages. He reached Agnes Kowalski's claim on the 9th day of the storm, expecting, by his own later account, to find a woman in serious distress given how thoroughly her structure had disappeared beneath snow. What he found instead, recorded in a letter he wrote to a medical colleague that winter, was a main room holding steady at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, about 18 degrees Celsius, achieved with a stove that had been fed only twice daily rather than continuously. Agnes's woodpile, split and stacked back in October, was barely half depleted, compared to neighboring households that had already burned through supplies they'd expected to last the entire winter. Pratt measured what he could with the instruments he carried. The stone-packed floor, even 11 days into sustained sub-zero cold, registered noticeably warmer underfoot than the bare plank floors he'd walked across in at least 4 other homes that same week. The interior walls showed no frost accumulation, no condensation staining. The earth-end straw insulation cavity was doing precisely what it was built to do, holding a stable temperature gradient rather than letting cold punch straight through. By his rough calculation, comparing woodpile consumption across 5 households he'd visited that week, Agnes was burning somewhere between 40 and 50% less firewood than her neighbors to maintain a warmer interior. Her floor stayed livable through the coldest stretch recorded that decade in the county, while at least 2 other households in the hollow reported burst water barrels and frozen interior surfaces during the same 11 days. Dr. Pratt didn't editorialize much in his letter. He simply wrote what he measured, and what he measured was a structure that everyone had mocked outperforming every conventional log cabin he'd visited that week, not by a small margin, but by a difference wide enough to matter for a family's survival. Word of Dr. Pratt's round spread through Larkspur Hollow faster than the roads reopened. It wasn't Agnes who told anyone what her woodpile looked like. It was the doctor, and then the mail carrier, and then the general store owner, each repeating a version of the same surprising fact. The widow with the burrow had come to the worst storm of memory, using half the wood everyone else had burned. Silas Redmond, by most local accounts, did not apologize outright. What he did instead, according to a story that circulated for years afterward, was walk out to Agnes's property that following spring and ask, without much ceremony, how the floor stones had been laid and how deep the earth cavity ran in the walls. He never publicly credited her for it, but the log cabin he built for a family the following autumn included, for the first time in his career, a stone-packed subfloor. Over the next 2 winters, at least 6 homesteads within a day's ride of Larkspur Hollow incorporated some version of what Agnes had built. Not always a full curved steel shell, which remained a rare and specific material available to few, but consistently the stone-packed floor cavity and the practice of banking earth against north-facing walls. What had been mocked as a badger den became, within a few short years, simply understood as smart building for the elevation. Agnes herself never framed what she'd done as innovation. In the one surviving account of her own words, recorded by a county assessor years later, she reportedly said only that she built the house to survive the wind that was actually there, rather than the house everyone assumed you were supposed to build. Agnes Kowalski wasn't trying to prove anything to Silas Redmond or to Larkspur Hollow. She was trying to survive a mountain winter alone, with limited materials and no formal training, using only careful observation of where her heat was actually going. What she arrived at, a low curve profile to deflect wind, thermal mass and stone to store and slowly release heat, insulating cavities to trap still air, and earth itself used as a stabilizing buffer. Wasn't luck and it wasn't magic. It was sound thermal engineering, built from instinct, necessity, and a willingness to be laughed at. The lesson of Larkspur Hollow isn't that tradition is wrong. It's that the traditions worth keeping are the ones that actually work in the conditions you're facing. And sometimes the person who figures that out first is the one everyone least expects to listen to. This video is presented for historical and educational purposes. Building techniques and structural methods described are based on regional building traditions and plausible historical reconstruction. They are not intended as engineering guidance and do not substitute for current building codes or professional structural advice. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight, and what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through?